One of the questions Pierre Yves asked is, how do you organize your code for multi-region? Do you set the region at the provider level, or providing location at each element, or including region in the directory structure, etc.? I think there's a few common patterns for how this is done. Probably the most conventional patterns I've seen in the Terraform community. And just to be clear, actually, we don't practice it this way, but the most conventional patterns I see in the Terraform community would be to have regional folders in your repository, as well as then possibly defining one or more providers in the Terraform code. Now, if you're doing this in the folder approach, you're really saying that this folder only ever has one provider for one region, which is pretty nice. But there's some edge cases where maybe to do terraforming easily, like setting up VPN connections, you might want to have multiple providers set up. So having like up to 2 providers, I think, is not a anti-pattern. There is an extreme case that we recently ran into, Matt Calhoun can talk about, which is that let's say you want to deploy Security Hub and you're trying to meet CIS, and in order for that to pass, you actually have to deploy it in every freaking region, and only, what is it? There's 16.
There's 16 that you can't disable.
And there's 16 core regions you can't disable. So that means that at minimum you have to deploy to 16 regions. So you have a couple choices here. You could have 16 providers for each one of those regions, but the thing is, you cannot not pass a provider when a module expects a provider for it. You can pass the same provider, but now you pass the same provider 16 times if you only want to be there. So here's the thing. I've kind of convinced ourselves, at least at Cloud Posse, we don't really want more than 2 providers per root module. And in our convention, which we haven't yet done a good job of documenting, we're currently working on it. If you go into like our Terraform, it's reference architectures. This is a work in progress and there is no documentation. This documentation is out of date here, but I bring it up because I want to show the stack configuration. So we don't follow the folder-based approach to organizing your infrastructure, because that imputes configuration in your file system, and we want to have all the configuration be in our configuration files. So we use this convention here. We are using an abbreviated form of the regions because resource names in AWS are limited in characters. And so here's like our US East 2 dev stack. So dev is the stage for us. And for us, our convention is to have 1 stage per account. So a dev account, a prod account. And then we might have multiple, so here's, in this case, here's US 2 infrastructure, and then here's US West 2 infrastructure, both for the prod account. And these are just the settings. So our modules, we call our root modules components these days. We used to call them Terraform root modules. Now we are calling our components Terraform AWS components, as if we would have Terraform GKE components, etc. And then under there are the submodules for all of these things that we would deploy. So these get vendored into a customer site, but these modules, they just assume that when they're invoked in the region they should be invoked in. And
an example is the DNS. If you go to the DNS delegated.
All right.
In the main file, I think, in the main file. So here you have providers, one for the delegation and one for the root.
Yes, good point. So thank you for bringing that up, Mohammed. That really drives home the point here. I forgot about that. So we have this concept. A lot of this stuff just comes up with, what's our naming convention? How do we generalize the concept of what we're trying to do? And this is one of those concepts that we have. So the concept that we have is primary and delegated. And we use that for like DNS. We use that for VPN connections. We use that for IAM. And the idea is that when we have a primary and delegated, that's when we're using multiple providers, a primary provider and a delegated provider, where the delegated provider might be another region, it might be another account, so and so forth. Why I like this pattern is, and this is something that we optimize for at Cloud Posse, is that we are building building blocks. We are creating building blocks that need to be composable. We are trying to make our reference architecture and our architecture opinionated about the interfaces, but not opinionated about the architecture as such. So that if we said that this, like if we were deploying Security Hub and we decided we had to have 16 providers, well, what if we wanted to have, these other 2 regions that weren't there? Okay, we got to extend it. Now we have 18 providers. And I just want to avoid that situation where this customer has totally different requirement on regions and the number of regions from this other customer. And these are the design considerations that go into the way we architect our modules. Let's see here. On that question here for multi-region. So to your point then, yeah, we are not doing regions, but that is a very conventional way of doing it. We set the provider. You're only allowed in Terraform 13 onwards. You're only allowed to set the provider in your root modules, not in submodules. So that also limits how you use regions. And providing location at each element. So this is the thing you can't do. Most Terraform resources, you cannot by convention set the region when provisioning that resource. The region is determined by the provider, and you have to provide the provider as a argument to calling the module.